So the tagline for this was monetizing GHG reductions, which John just did a great job of giving an overview of that. Tim asked me to talk about what are some of the other, whether they're monetary or non-monetary opportunities, and I think a lot of this is looking at the public sector and what the public sector can be doing. But as a teaser, I kind of put a third tagline under there, a third subtitle is food for thought. This presentation is really just to kind of get you to start thinking and looking at what are the different ways that we could start looking at how are we going to reduce fuels and how can we eventually either monetize that or just gain some sort of benefit out of that in the long term. So just kind of keep that in your thought. We're all pretty familiar with what emissions look like in California. Since we're all really dealing with the transportation sector, I just did it, the two important things of transportation and then everything else that we're representing pretty much half of the emissions that are going on out there and looking at how we can reduce that. So it's a pretty big part of the pie that we need to be looking at. If I put my SACOG hat on, I think about that we can really reduce emissions in three ways, or there's three strategies. One is we're just reducing the number of trips. So how do we just use vehicles less? Second is reducing the miles. So how do we get a little bit better about thinking about how do we take shorter trips? And then the last is reducing the fuels, and that's really just either reducing the consumption of them or reducing the amount of tailpipe emissions or the amount of carbon if we're thinking about just GHG. So focusing on reducing trips, how do we do this? Well, as I said, we just take fewer trips overall. SACOG thought about a lot of this from the commuter standpoint, which doesn't really get to the fleet side, but there is a lot of similarities and a lot of strategies that are starting to be deployed, especially at the public sector side from that. More walking, more biking, more transit is how we think about it from the commuter standpoint, but there may be some opportunities for that as well. There was a report that went out not too long ago about can you use things like ride-hailing and car sharing in public sector? So if you're sending out, for example, if you're sending out somebody to do inspections in a particular development, maybe there's ride-hailing or car sharing opportunities that can be done there. And I think there are some jurisdictions that are looking at things like that. Can you take credit for that? Probably at some point. You can go into something like the Climate Action Plan. So who gets credit for this? And I'm breaking a lot of these down into light-duty vehicles versus medium and heavy-duty vehicles. So on the light-duty side, largely this is going to be your MPOs that are going to get credit for this because, and I'll take a step back, your MPO, your local MPO, has to hit a target every 4 years as mandated by ARB on these light-duty vehicles on how many GHG they're reducing. In our region in Sacramento, it was 16, now it's 19. So we have to reduce GHG from light-duty vehicles by 19%. We have to model and show that. And any reduction that we're getting, that's largely from the MPO. But obviously there are some fleet operator opportunities there as well, especially on the public sector side, looking at things, again, like climate action plans and other strategies you can put in there because they are on the hook to reduce emissions that way as well. But when you move to the medium and heavy duty side, that gets completely away from the MPO and less from the public sector, unless they're running those fleets as well, and moves more into the fleet operator, again, public and private. So if we're thinking of just reducing trips, this is things like telematics and logistics. Can you just plan a little bit better about how you're running your fleet or operating your fleet? And then smaller fleets. I put the two examples of ride sharing and ride hailing that I mentioned before. There are opportunities like that, but again, just thinking about from a planning perspective and how you use your fleet, is there a way to reduce the number of trips that way? And I'll get to how all of this could potentially be beneficial later. The second one is reducing miles. So you reduce your trips as much as you can through those various strategies, and then you're looking at how might you reduce your miles. Really, how are you doing this is either land use. You're literally just locating closer to where you're ultimately going to go. But as we have more people doing things like shopping online and ordering things from Amazon and other things like that, that land use becomes a little bit smaller. And the second one is just through better planning, whether that's how you operate your fleet or again logistics. So Who gets credit for that? Again, anytime you see LDV down there, you're pretty much going to have your MPO. Again, they're modeling all of this. They're working with the various modeling tools and getting a bunch of diagnostics and data out of all of the companies, really doing big data purchases. So they're going to get a lot of that credit. But again, on that local and public side, the fleet operators are going to be getting that. The big push is going to be on the medium and heavy duty side. Logistics, telematics, again, on the planning side. I put a question mark down. There's got to be more strategies on how you can reduce miles more than just thinking about it from a logistics standpoint. I know that, again, putting my MPO hat on, that there's a lot of conversations that we have with people around land use and how can we think about things a little bit smarter. And so there's got to be some benefits to not having traditional planning from that land use perspective, just being land use planners being in a room, but really talking to everybody, whether that's business owners, property owners, or fleet operators. How can we all think about land use a little bit smarter and be a little bit more efficient? And so there's going to be opportunities to tie into benefit both monetarily and not from that perspective as well. And then the last one is this idea of reducing fuels. So there's a couple ways you can do that. You improve the fuels, so there's a lower carbon fuels that you're putting into your vehicle, or you're improving the vehicle technology itself. Maybe they're just getting higher MPG, or you're moving to an alternative fuel altogether. So again, who gets the credit? MPOs get a little bit on the light duty side. Very little on that. We basically have to say, what are we doing that goes above and beyond what the state is already planning for, and if there's an opportunity to prove that that is the case. In our example here, in our region, SACOG Ag has actually dedicated a lot of resources and money to providing charging infrastructure, so we're able to take a light credit for that. But most of that on the light duty side, from the fuel perspective, is going to be going to the fleet operators. So that might be, and as John alluded to in his presentation, occurred throughout the day, and there's probably lots of threads that you can see, but that's probably the best opportunity from this perspective. And then the medium and heavy duty side is definitely the fleet operator. I wanted to dive into that because I think that's really the focus of what we'd be looking on. While there are opportunities in all of these other categories, and I think we can get a little bit smarter, but that's way outside of the box. And I think in that May conversation, it'd be great to get outside of that box and start to have that conversation. But I think this is probably definitely the low-hanging fruit. When I think about medium and heavy-duty vehicles, and everybody probably categorizes these a little bit differently, but how I was thinking about it for this presentation really broke down into three categories. One was just a transit provider. In our region, there are a lot of transit vehicles out there moving around. When we, every year, SACOG does an inventory of how many transit vehicles, I'm surprised at how gigantic these fleets are. The other one is just public sector fleets. This is light, medium, and heavy duty, but again, this is focused on the medium and heavy duty side. And then there's a bunch of private fleets obviously out there. Transit is already mandated through ARB to move to zero-emission vehicles by 2040. Exactly what that looks like is still yet to be determined. There's a lot of conversations between the transit providers and ARBs happening. Airports are moving in that direction as well. There's a mandate from ARB, and others are probably going to be there soon. That's why I put 3 question marks, because ultimately all of these different sectors are probably going to be mandated. It'd be great to be ahead of the curve. One, so we can start to think about the benefits and mandating that, but 2, so we can start to work with ARB. So it's not just ARB handing something down, and this is definitely what's happening on the transit side, which is why there's so much back and forth conversation, because there was a mandate put down without really understanding from the transit provider's perspective what needs to happen. And I think we're probably going to see that with every other thing. So if we can be a little bit ahead of the curve and work with ARB on that and let them know exactly when they start to put these other regulations down how that should work, I think that's to our advantage. The public sector, I put a dollar sign up there. There's obviously going to be some monetary things, as John alluded to, but there's a lot of other benefits as well. Disadvantaged communities is a big push for all state funding moving forward. What are the impacts you're having in disadvantaged communities from all of your programs? And I think there's a great opportunity for public and private partnerships looking at this about, and it doesn't affect so much on the GHG side, but definitely on the air quality side, because that's more of a local air pollution issue, but it obviously ties into tailpipe emissions ties into GHG in general. So I think through things like climate action plans and offsite mitigation is something that we could look at with this. And then I bolded and italicized partnerships onto the private side because I think there's a big missed opportunity. I know there's a lot of partnerships that happen between public and private sector, but I think there's a lot more opportunities, and especially as we start to look at what are these benefits for these partnerships, how are we going to be reducing GHG emissions, and again looking at that local air quality issues around disadvantaged communities, I think there's a great opportunity. There was John earlier talked about the ports. I think if we look at the Port of West Sacramento, that's a perfect example about there's a lot of trucks coming in and out of that port. And there's a lot of disadvantaged communities right around that port. So there's great opportunities, and there's a lot of money that's available in those. So how can we, as fleet operators, start to think about that? And then under that, I also put again that sharing vehicles, sharing infrastructure, sharing data. NPOs in the public sector having a lot of this data would be hugely beneficial. And then I also put offsets up there, working with the public sector on things like climate action plans. As they have future development, they're always going to need to have offsets or ways to mitigate GHG and other air quality issues, and working with the private sector on coming up with some of these offsets. Again, kind of thinking outside of the box on what those might be. I put this up there. This is a slide I stole from somebody else, but I really liked what this was kind of getting at, and looking at one, the quote up above, that there's really two things that we're looking at is greater vehicle efficiency, but then I underlined that upstream energy source flexibility, and I probably should have double underlined flexibility, because I think if you look at the pie charts and how the CO2 per mile is broken down, and at the very end here we have electric vehicles, and you look at the fuel source for those electric vehicles, that's where that flexibility piece comes in. So not only is it a smaller amount of carbon, but you've got a lot more flexibility. And so how can the public and private sector work together, and especially up that chain or up that stream of where those fuels come from. So in closing, again, this was just more of a teaser and really food for thought about how do we start to think about partnerships and gaining benefit out of all this. And I really think it comes down to partnerships, public, private, private, and really starting to look at that upstream energy providers. And I know we have somebody from SMUD in the office, and maybe we can all corner him after this meeting and start to really think about that, about how can we bring SMUD into this as well. So I'll be sticking around afterwards if there's any questions, but thank you for your time.